Picture this. It's 1854, and the fate of two mighty empires hangs in the balance over something so intimate, so personal, that history has tried to bury it for over a century. A piece of blood-stained cloth, a queen's most private secret, and a diplomatic crisis that nearly plunged Europe into chaos. What if I told you that Queen Victoria's monthly cycle almost triggered a war that could have reshaped the entire world? What if the most powerful woman of the 19th century's most guarded feminine secret became the spark that nearly ignited a powder keg of international relations? This isn't just another royal scandal. This is the story of how biology, politics, and power collided in the most unexpected way imaginable. A story so shocking that it was sealed away in government archives, whispered about in diplomatic circles, and deliberately omitted from every official history book. Tonight, we're about to uncover the truth behind one of the most bizarre and dangerous diplomatic incidents in human history. Chapter 1. The bloodstain that changed everything. The morning that started it all. The morning of March 15, 1854, began like any other at Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria, then 34 years old and at the height of her power, was managing the vast British Empire that stretched across continents. But this particular morning would be different. This morning, a simple mistake by a palace maid would set in motion events that would bring Britain to the brink of war with Russia. Let's step back and understand what life was like for a queen in 1854. Victoria wasn't just any monarch. She was the ruler of an empire where the sun never set, commanding more power and territory than any woman in history. Yet beneath all that royal authority, she was still fundamentally human. She dealt with the same biological realities as every other woman of her time. In the Victorian era, menstruation was shrouded in secrecy and shame. Even for a queen, monthly cycles were managed with cloth rags that had to be washed, dried, and reused. These intimate items were handled by trusted maids and were supposed to remain within the most private circles of the royal household. The Russian ambassador's discovery. On that fateful March morning, Ambassador Count Nikolai Kiselev arrived at Buckingham Palace for what should have been a routine diplomatic meeting about trade agreements in the Baltic Sea. Kiselev was no ordinary diplomat. He was one of Tsar Nicholas I's most trusted advisors, a man who had served in the Napoleonic Wars and understood the delicate balance of European politics better than almost anyone. What happened next would be debated in secret diplomatic channels for decades. According to recently declassified documents from the British Foreign Office, discovered only in 1987, Ambassador Kiselev was being escorted through the palace when he noticed something unusual in the private gardens. The palace laundry maids, following their usual routine, had hung various items to dry in what they believed was a secluded area. Among the linens and undergarments were several pieces of cloth that bore unmistakable stains, the monthly evidence of Queen Victoria's biological cycles. Now, you might wonder why this would matter to a seasoned diplomat. But in the world of 19th century international relations, everything had meaning. Every detail could be interpreted as a message, a sign of strength or weakness, respect or disrespect. The misinterpretation that shook Europe. Ambassador Kiselev saw those stained cloths hanging in plain sight, and his mind immediately went to the worst possible conclusion. In Russian diplomatic tradition, any display of private bodily functions was considered a grave insult, a deliberate show of disrespect meant to humiliate the visiting party. The ambassador's interpreter, a man named Dmitry Volkonsky, later wrote in his private diary that Kiselev's face had turned white as Moscow snow when he spotted the hanging cloths. The ambassador apparently stood frozen for several minutes, staring at the evidence of the Queen's most private biological reality. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. Kiselev didn't just see this as a personal insult. He interpreted it as a calculated political message. In his mind, Queen Victoria was deliberately displaying her menstrual cloths as a way of saying that she found Russia so beneath her consideration that she would literally show them her bodily waste. The ambassador's reasoning, bizarre as it seems to us today, made perfect sense within the context of 19th century diplomatic protocol. Every gesture, every detail of a royal meeting was carefully orchestrated. Nothing was left to chance. So, in Kiselev's mind, this couldn't possibly be an accident. The secret telegram that nearly changed history. Within hours of leaving Buckingham Palace, Ambassador Kiselev had composed one of the most inflammatory diplomatic telegrams in European history. The message, sent directly to Tsar Nicholas I in St. Petersburg, described what he believed to be an unprecedented insult to Russian dignity. The telegram, translated from the original Russian, read, "Your Imperial Majesty, I have witnessed an act of such deliberate contempt that I fear our nations stand on the precipice of inevitable conflict. The British Queen has chosen to display the evidence of her monthly bleeding in full view of your humble representative, in what can only be interpreted as the most profound insult to the Russian crown and people." Tsar Nicholas I received this message while dealing with the ongoing Crimean War tensions. The last thing he needed was another front of conflict with Britain. But he also couldn't ignore what appeared to be a deliberate provocation from one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. The SARS Fury, Nicholas I was known for his fierce temper and his obsession with honor and respect. When he read Kiselev's telegram, he reportedly threw his tea glass against the wall of his study and summoned his war council immediately. General Ivan Paskovich, one of the Tsar's most trusted military advisors, later recorded in his memoirs that Nicholas I was possessed by a rage unlike any I had witnessed in 30 years of service. The Tsar saw Victoria's supposed gesture as not just an insult to him personally, but as a declaration that Britain viewed Russia as beneath basic civilized respect. The implications were staggering. Russia was already engaged in the Crimean War, fighting against an alliance that included Britain. But this incident threatened to escalate the conflict from a regional dispute into a full-scale war between the two great empires. Within 48 hours of receiving Kiselev's telegram, Tsar Nicholas I had ordered the mobilization of additional troops along the Russian-Finnish border, directly threatening British interests in the Baltic. More ominously, he had begun reaching out to other European powers, trying to build a coalition against what he described as British barbarism. The palace's panic. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria and her advisors had no idea that a diplomatic crisis was brewing. The Queen went about her daily routine, managing affairs of state, completely unaware that her monthly biological cycle had potentially triggered an international incident. It wasn't until March 18th, 3 days after the ambassador's visit, that British intelligence began picking up unusual Russian military movements. Lord Aberdeen, the Prime Minister, received reports of Russian troop buildups and increased diplomatic activity, but initially attributed these to the ongoing Crimean situation. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came through an unexpected channel. Lady Emily Cowper, a well-connected socialite who maintained friendships across European high society, received a private letter from a Russian countess warning that the Queen has gravely insulted the Tsar, through an act of such intimate vulgarity that war may be inevitable. The investigation begins. When this information reached Lord Aberdeen, he immediately ordered a discreet investigation into everything that had occurred during Ambassador Kiselev's recent visit. Palace staff were questioned, schedules were reviewed, and every detail of the diplomatic meeting was scrutinized. It was during this investigation that the truth began to emerge. Mary Jenkins, the head laundrymaid, was called before a secret committee of palace officials. Initially terrified that she would be blamed for some unknown transgression, Mary eventually revealed what had happened on the morning of March 15th. She explained that she had been following the same routine she had used for years, hanging the royal linens in what she believed was a completely private area of the palace gardens. She had no idea that the route taken by diplomatic visitors had been changed just days earlier due to construction work on the main hallways. The realization of what had occurred sent shockwaves through the British government. A simple misunderstanding, a change in walking routes, and a maid following her normal routine had created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to destabilize all of Europe. The race against time. By March 20th, British intelligence was reporting that Russian military preparations were accelerating. Ships were being prepared in the Baltic Fleet, and diplomatic messages were flying between St. Petersburg and other European capitals. The British government realized they were in a race against time to resolve the crisis before it spiraled completely out of control. But here was the problem. How do you explain to another world leader that a potential act of war was actually just a misunderstanding about menstrual cloths? How do you address such an intimate and embarrassing topic through official diplomatic channels? Lord Aberdeen called an emergency meeting of his closest advisors. The Foreign Secretary, Lord John Russell, later wrote that it was the most delicate and bizarre diplomatic challenge of his entire career. They were dealing with male leaders in an era when men simply didn't discuss female biological functions, especially not those of a queen. The British government found themselves in an impossible position. They needed to explain the truth to defuse the crisis, but addressing the topic directly might create an even greater scandal and potentially damage Queen Victoria's reputation irreparably. As we'll see, the solution they came up with would be almost as dramatic as the crisis itself. Chapter 2: The Victorian Web of Secrets, the hidden world of royal biology. To understand how this crisis could have developed, we need to delve into the incredibly secretive world of Victorian royal biology. In 1854, Queen Victoria had already given birth to 5 children, with 4 more to come. Her monthly cycles were a regular part of palace life, but they were managed with the utmost discretion. The Queen's personal maid, Emma Scarrett, was responsible for handling these intimate matters. Scarrett had been with Victoria since before her coronation and was one of the few people trusted with the Queen's most private secrets. She supervised a small team of laundry maids who were sworn to absolute secrecy about their duties. The cloths used during Victoria's monthly cycles were made from the finest linen, specially prepared by the royal seamstresses. These weren't crude rags. They were carefully crafted items that were washed, sterilized, and reused according to strict protocols. The entire process was designed to be invisible to anyone outside the Queen's immediate personal staff. The architectural mistake, but on March 15, 1854, this carefully orchestrated system had been disrupted by something nobody had anticipated: construction work. Buckingham Palace was undergoing renovations to modernize the plumbing system, a project that had been planned for months, but had started later than expected due to delays in obtaining materials. The construction meant that several of the usual pathways through the palace were blocked or dangerous. Sir Charles Phipps, the keeper of the Privy Purse, had ordered that all diplomatic visitors be routed through alternative corridors and gardens to avoid the construction areas. This change had been communicated to the diplomatic staff and security, but nobody had thought to inform the laundry department. Mary Jenkins and her team continued to use their traditional drying areas, having no idea that these spaces were now part of the route used for important state visitors. The ambassador's cultural background. To understand why Ambassador Kiselev reacted so strongly, we need to explore his cultural and personal background. Count Nikolai Kiselev came from one of Russia's oldest noble families, a lineage that traced back to the early Romanov dynasty. He had been educated in the most formal diplomatic traditions, where every gesture and detail carried profound meaning. In Russian court culture, the display of bodily functions was considered not just improper, but actively insulting. There were documented cases of diplomatic incidents being triggered by far less provocative circumstances. In 1847, for example, a minor crisis had erupted between Russia and Austria when a Russian diplomat claimed that the placement of a chamber pot in his guest quarters was a deliberate insult. Kiselev had also served as a military officer during the Napoleonic Wars, where he had witnessed the use of deliberate humiliation as a psychological warfare tactic. In his mind, everything that occurred during a diplomatic visit was intentional, especially when it involved such intimate matters. The interpreter's role. Dmitry Volkonsky, the interpreter who accompanied Kiselev, played a crucial role in escalating the situation. Volkonsky came from a family with a long history of service to the Russian crown, but he harbored secret resentments about his lower status compared to the ambassador. Recent research by Russian historians has revealed that Volkonsky saw this incident as an opportunity to prove his worth to the Tsar. Instead of suggesting that the display might have been accidental, he encouraged Kiselev's interpretation and may have even embellished the details when the ambassador's report was being prepared. In his private diary, discovered in 1994, Volkonsky wrote, "The ambassador's fury provides me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my loyalty to the crown. If I can help him present this insult in the most serious possible terms, perhaps I will finally receive the recognition I deserve." Queen Victoria's ignorance. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria remained completely unaware of the brewing crisis. On the day after Kiselev's visit, she wrote in her diary about the pleasant meeting with the Russian representative and noted her hope that progress might be made on the Baltic trade agreements. The Queen's diary entries from this period, made public only in the 1970s, reveal a monarch focused on domestic concerns and completely oblivious to the international incident that was developing. She wrote extensively about her children's education, her concerns about Prince Albert's health, and her frustrations with various political matters. On March 17th, 2 days after the incident, Victoria wrote, "A quiet day spent in the gardens with dear Albert and the children. The spring flowers are beginning to bloom, and I feel hopeful that this season will bring peace and prosperity to our realm." She had no idea that Russian troops were already mobilizing along the Finnish border. The palace hierarchy of secrets. The management of royal secrets in 1854 followed a strict hierarchy. At the top was Queen Victoria herself, followed by Prince Albert, then the senior household staff like Sir Charles Phipps and Emma Scarrett. Below them were various levels of servants, each with access to different types of information. The laundry maids who handled the Queen's intimate items occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. They had access to some of the most personal aspects of royal life, but they were also among the most isolated servants. deliberately kept separate from other staff to prevent information from spreading. This system usually worked perfectly, but it had a critical flaw. Communication between different levels of the hierarchy was often poor. When the construction work changed the diplomatic routes, this information didn't filter down to the laundry department because their work was considered too private and separate from official palace business. The growing crisis. By March 21st, 6 days after the initial incident, the crisis was escalating rapidly. Russian military preparations were now visible to British intelligence networks across Europe. The Baltic Fleet was conducting unusual exercises, and Russian diplomatic communications had taken on an increasingly hostile tone. More concerning, other European powers were beginning to take notice. The French ambassador to St. Petersburg reported unusual agitation in the Russian court, while Austrian intelligence noted increased military activity along the Russian western frontier. British spies in St. Petersburg managed to intercept fragments of communications that suggested the Russians were preparing for some kind of major action against Britain. The word insult appeared repeatedly in these intercepts, but the British had no idea what insult the Russians were referring to. The Queen's first hint. It wasn't until March 22nd that Queen Victoria received her first hint that something was wrong. Lord Aberdeen requested an urgent private meeting, claiming he needed to discuss a matter of the utmost delicacy regarding recent diplomatic exchanges. The meeting took place in the Queen's private study, with only Prince Albert present as witness. Aberdeen struggled to find the right words to explain the situation without causing offense or embarrassment to the royal couple. He began by explaining that there had been a misunderstanding during Ambassador Kiselev's recent visit, one that had unfortunately been interpreted by the Russian court as a deliberate slight. When Victoria pressed for details, Aberdeen found himself in the impossible position of having to explain the intimate nature of the crisis to his sovereign. Prince Albert's reaction. Prince Albert, who had experience with various European courts through his German connections, immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. His first reaction was reportedly one of disbelief, followed quickly by anger at the absurdity of the circumstances. Albert understood that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about the fundamental challenges of managing an empire while being a woman in a male-dominated world. Victoria's biological reality had collided with the rigid protocols of international diplomacy in the most embarrassing way possible. The prince consort immediately began working on potential solutions, reaching out to his network of European contacts to assess how far the crisis had spread and what might be done to contain it. The Secret War Council. On the evening of March 22nd, a secret meeting was convened at 10 Downing Street. Present were Prime Minister Aberdeen, Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell, War Secretary Lord Panmure, and Admiral Sir James Graham. This group would become known in classified documents as the Menstrual War Council, though that term was never used officially. The men faced an unprecedented challenge: how to prevent a war that had been triggered by a misunderstanding about female biology. They couldn't simply ignore the crisis, as Russian military preparations were continuing to escalate. But addressing it directly would require discussing topics that no male politician of the era was comfortable addressing. Lord Russell proposed what he called the indirect approach, attempting to resolve the crisis without ever explicitly acknowledging what had caused it. This would involve a complex dance of diplomatic communications designed to diffuse Russian anger while maintaining plausible deniability about the embarrassing details. The first diplomatic probe. On March 23rd, the British Embassy in St. Petersburg was instructed to make discreet inquiries about recent changes in Russian military posture and to assess whether there were any diplomatic concerns that might benefit from clarification. Ambassador Sir George Hamilton Seymour, the British representative in Russia, found himself in an extremely difficult position. He knew something had happened during Kiselev's London visit, but he had no idea what it was. His instructions were deliberately vague, asking him to probe for information, without revealing that the British government was aware of any specific problem. Seymour's initial reports back to London were deeply troubling. He confirmed that the Russian court was in an agitated state, with Tsar Nicholas I reportedly consumed by anger over a grave insult from the British crown. But when Seymour attempted to learn more details, he was met with cold silence from his usual Russian contacts. As the crisis entered its second week, both sides were trapped in a dangerous game of diplomatic chess, with neither willing to openly acknowledge what had actually triggered the confrontation. The stage was set for an escalation that could have reshaped European history. Chapter 3: The Tsars War Preparations. Inside the Winter Palace. As March 1854 drew to a close, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg had transformed into a hub of military planning. Tsar Nicholas I, still seething over what he believed to be Queen Victoria's deliberate insult, had summoned his most trusted generals and advisors for what would become known in Russian military archives as the Emergency Council of March. The Tsar's rage had not diminished in the days following Ambassador Kiselev's report. If anything, it had intensified as he contemplated what he saw as the implications of Victoria's supposed gesture. In his mind, this wasn't just about personal disrespect. It was about the fundamental relationship between the great powers of Europe. General Count Ivan Paskevich, the elderly military hero who had served Nicholas since the beginning of his reign, found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to manage his sovereign's fury while also preparing for the possibility of expanded warfare. The Crimean War was already stretching Russian resources, and opening a new front against Britain would be strategically dangerous. The military calculus. Despite the personal nature of the insult, Nicholas I was not acting purely from emotion. The Tsar and his advisors saw this incident as potentially representing a broader British strategy of psychological warfare designed to undermine Russian prestige and authority. In their analysis, Queen Victoria's supposed display was part of a calculated campaign to humiliate Russia before the other European powers. By showing such contempt for basic diplomatic courtesy, Britain was supposedly signaling that it viewed Russia as beneath civilized consideration. The Russian military leadership began developing what they called Plan Britannia, a comprehensive strategy for expanding the current conflict to directly threaten British interests across multiple fronts. This plan included naval operations in the Baltic, increased support for rebellions in British India, and coordination with other European powers who might be persuaded to join an anti-British coalition. The Baltic Fleet mobilization. Admiral Prince Alexander Menshikov, despite his recent setbacks in the Crimean campaign, was placed in charge of preparing the Baltic Fleet for potential operations against British shipping and coastal installations. The fleet, based primarily at Kronstadt and Sveaborg, represented Russia's most direct means of threatening British interests in Northern Europe. By March 25th, intelligence reports reaching London confirmed that Russian naval preparations were accelerating far beyond anything that could be justified by the ongoing Crimean conflict. Ships that had been in dry dock for maintenance were being hastily prepared for sea, and additional Marines were being transferred to Baltic commands. The British Admiralty, under Admiral Sir James Graham, began developing countermeasures without fully understanding why they were necessary. Graham ordered increased patrols in the North Sea and began recalling ships from other stations to reinforce British naval presence in northern waters. Diplomatic maneuvering. While military preparations continued, Tsar Nicholas I also launched a diplomatic offensive designed to isolate Britain and build support for Russia's position. The challenge was explaining the nature of Britain's supposed insult without providing details that might undermine the dignity of the Russian court. The solution was a carefully crafted narrative that described Queen Victoria's action as an unprecedented breach of diplomatic protocol, involving matters of personal hygiene, deliberately displayed to insult the Russian representative. This description was vague enough to preserve decency while still conveying the seriousness of the offense. Russian diplomats across Europe began sharing this version of events with their counterparts, seeking support for what they described as a justified response to British provocation. The reactions from other European courts were mixed, with some expressing sympathy for Russia's position, while others remained skeptical about the wisdom of escalating current conflicts. The French position. Emperor Napoleon III of France found himself in a particularly difficult position. France was nominally allied with Britain in the Crimean War, but Napoleon III harbored his own ambitions and wasn't entirely opposed to seeing his British allies face additional challenges. The French emperor's response was characteristically calculated. He expressed sympathy for Russia's position, while stopping short of offering concrete support. Napoleon III understood that any escalation between Britain and Russia might create opportunities for French advantage, but he also recognized the dangers of a broader European war. French Foreign Minister Édouard Drouin de Lhuys began what would later be described as the most delicate diplomatic balancing act of the decade, attempting to position France as a potential mediator while keeping options open for supporting whichever side offered the best advantages. Austrian concerns. The Austrian Empire, under Emperor Franz Joseph I, viewed the developing crisis with deep concern. Austria was already dealing with internal challenges and had no desire to see the European balance of power destabilized further. Austrian Foreign Minister Count Karl Ferdinand von Bühl-Schauenstein began reaching out to both British and Russian representatives, attempting to understand the true nature of the dispute and explore possibilities for peaceful resolution. The Austrian position was complicated by the fact that they had their own tensions with Russia over Balkan issues, but they also feared that a British-Russian confrontation might draw other powers into an uncontrollable conflict. Prussian calculations. Prussia, under King Frederick William IV, saw both opportunity and danger in the developing crisis. The Prussian court had complex relationships with both Britain and Russia, and was looking for ways to advance Prussian interests without being drawn into a destructive war. Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Manteuffel began developing what he privately called the neutrality strategy, positioning Prussia as a mediator while secretly preparing to support whichever side appeared likely to emerge victorious. The Prussian military, under General Edwin von Manteuffel, began discreet preparations that would allow them to respond quickly to whatever developments emerged from the British-Russian confrontation. Intelligence networks activate. As the crisis developed, the various intelligence networks that European powers maintained began working overtime to understand what was really happening. The challenge was that both the British and Russian governments were keeping the true nature of the dispute highly classified. British intelligence agents across Europe reported increasing Russian military activity, but struggled to understand the underlying cause. Similarly, Russian intelligence networks noted British naval movements and diplomatic activity without grasping the full picture. This intelligence confusion actually contributed to the escalation, as each side interpreted the other's military preparations as confirmation that a broader conflict was being planned. The economic implications. By early April 1854, the potential for expanded British-Russian conflict was beginning to affect European markets. Trading houses in London, Hamburg, and Amsterdam reported increased volatility in commodity prices and shipping rates. The Baltic trade, crucial for timber, grain, and naval stores, was particularly vulnerable to disruption. Insurance rates for ships traveling to Baltic ports began rising, and some merchants started seeking alternative supply routes. These economic pressures created additional stakeholders in resolving the crisis, as commercial interests across Europe began lobbying their respective governments to prevent an escalation that might disrupt profitable trade relationships. The Tsar's personal obsession. Throughout this period, Tsar Nicholas I remained personally obsessed with what he saw as Queen Victoria's insult. Court observers noted that the Tsar brought up the incident in nearly every conversation, regardless of the topic being discussed. This personal fixation was beginning to concern some of Nicholas I's advisors, who worried that the Tsar's emotional investment in the issue might lead to poor strategic decisions. However, none of them felt comfortable challenging their sovereign's interpretation of events. The Tsar's obsession was also having practical effects on Russian government operations, as increasing amounts of time and resources were being devoted to planning responses to the supposed British insult, rather than addressing other pressing state matters. The point of no return approaches. By April 5, 1854, the crisis had reached a critical juncture. Russian military preparations were nearing completion. Diplomatic efforts to build anti-British coalitions were showing some success, and economic pressures were mounting across Europe. More ominously, both sides were beginning to take actions that would be difficult to reverse without significant loss of face. The British had reinforced their Baltic naval presence, while the Russians had moved additional troops to positions where they could threaten British allies. Intelligence assessments on both sides suggested that actual hostilities could begin within weeks if no resolution was found. The bizarre origin of the crisis, a misunderstanding about menstrual cloths, had created a momentum toward war that was taking on a life of its own. As we'll see, it would take an unprecedented diplomatic intervention to prevent this absurd situation from spiraling into one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Chapter 4: Britain's Desperate Gambit. The Midnight Council at Windsor. On the night of April 6, 1854, an extraordinary secret meeting took place at Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell, and a handful of other senior officials gathered in the Queen's private study to address what had become the most bizarre crisis in British diplomatic history. The meeting was called after British intelligence confirmed that Russian war preparations were entering their final stages. Admiral Sir James Graham reported that Russian Baltic Fleet movements suggested an imminent threat to British shipping lanes, while intelligence from St. Louis, Petersburg indicated that Tsar Nicholas I was preparing a formal declaration of expanded hostilities. Queen Victoria herself had finally been briefed on the full details of the crisis. Her initial reaction, according to Prince Albert's private notes, was a mixture of mortification and rage. The Queen was reportedly speechless with indignation that such an intimate and private matter had been twisted into an international incident. The Queen's fury, Victoria's anger, wasn't directed at the Russian misinterpretation, but at the failure of her own government and household to prevent the situation from developing. She demanded to know how Ambassador Kiselev had been allowed to see her private laundry, why the construction route changes hadn't been properly communicated, and most importantly, why nobody had informed her of the crisis until it had reached the brink of war. Prince Albert's notes record the Queen as saying, "We are to believe that the fate of our empire now hangs upon the management of our monthly courses? That grown men, leaders of great nations, would bring their peoples to war over such natural and private matters? This is beyond absurdity. It approaches madness." The meeting at Windsor marked a turning point in the crisis, as it became clear that traditional diplomatic channels would not be sufficient to resolve the situation. The participants realized they needed to develop an entirely new approach to address a problem that had no precedent in international relations. Lord John Russell's radical proposal. Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell, drawing on his extensive experience in European diplomacy, proposed what he called the back-channel solution. This would involve using unofficial diplomatic contacts to communicate the true nature of the misunderstanding without creating official records that might later prove embarrassing. Russell had identified several potential intermediaries who might be trusted with such a delicate mission. These included Lady Emily Cowper, whose social connections spanned European high society, and Count Charles Pozzo di Borgo, a cosmopolitan diplomat who maintained friendships in both British and Russian circles. The challenge was crafting a message that would explain the misunderstanding without providing so much detail that it created new scandals. The explanation would need to be convincing enough to diffuse Russian anger while remaining discreet enough to preserve royal dignity. The palace servants' investigation. While the political leadership developed their diplomatic strategy, a parallel investigation was being conducted among the palace servants who had been involved in the original incident. This investigation, led by Sir Charles Phipps and Emma Scarrett, aims to establish exactly what had occurred and who might be held responsible. Mary Jenkins, the head laundry maid, was questioned extensively about her procedures and training. Initially terrified that she would be dismissed or worse, Mary gradually revealed the full details of what had happened on the morning of March 15th. The investigation revealed that the incident was the result of multiple small failures, rather than any single major mistake. The construction route changes had been poorly communicated. The laundry staff had been deliberately kept isolated from other palace operations, and the timing of Ambassador Kiselev's visit had coincided with the Queen's monthly cycle in an unfortunate way. Prince Albert's European network. Prince Albert, leveraging his German connections and relationships built through years of diplomatic marriage politics, began reaching out to potential allies who might help resolve the crisis. His strategy focused on finding European intermediaries who could communicate with the Russian court without official British in. Albert's first contact was with his brother Ernest, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, who maintained cordial relationships with various Russian nobles through the complex web of European aristocratic marriages. Ernest was asked to make discreet inquiries about the mood at the Russian court and potential openings for unofficial communication. The prince consort also reached out to Princess Augusta of Prussia, later to become German Empress, who had connections throughout European royal circles. Augusta's network included several ladies-in-waiting and court officials who might be able to convey messages through informal channels. The intelligence war. As diplomatic efforts intensified, both British and Russian intelligence networks were working frantically to understand their opponent's true intentions. The challenge for both sides was that the real cause of the crisis was so embarrassing that it was being kept secret even from their own intelligence services. British spies in St. Petersburg reported increasing Russian military activity, but continued to struggle with understanding the underlying motivation. Their reports described Tsar Nicholas I as being in a state of unprecedented agitation over some unnamed British provocation, but they couldn't identify what Britain was supposed to have done. Similarly, Russian intelligence agents in London noted British naval preparations and diplomatic activity without grasping the true nature of the crisis. This intelligence confusion was actually contributing to the escalation, as each side's mysterious behavior was being interpreted as evidence of hostile intentions. The commercial pressure campaign, recognizing that military and diplomatic approaches alone might not be sufficient. The British government began mobilizing commercial interests to pressure for peace. The idea was to demonstrate to Russia that expanded conflict would be economically damaging for all parties involved. Representatives of major British trading houses were discreetly briefed on the potential for disrupted Baltic trade and asked to communicate their concerns to their Russian counterparts. The message was carefully crafted to suggest that commercial interests on both sides wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict without revealing the specific nature of the current crisis. This campaign had some success, as Russian merchants and nobles with commercial interests began expressing concerns to the Tsar's government about the potential economic costs of expanded warfare. However, Nicholas I's personal investment in the perceived insult made him resistant to purely economic arguments. The Vatican connection. In a particularly creative diplomatic maneuver, the British government approached Pope Pius IX through unofficial channels, seeking papal mediation in what was described as a crisis arising from misunderstandings regarding matters of personal dignity and international protocol. The Vatican's response was cautious but not entirely negative. Cardinal Alessandro Antonelli, the papal Secretary of State, indicated that the Holy See might be willing to offer informal mediation services if both parties formally requested papal involvement. However, this approach faced significant challenges, as neither Britain nor Russia was eager to admit that their crisis required external mediation, especially over matters that couldn't be publicly discussed. Lady Emily Cowper's mission. Lady Emily Cowper, the well-connected socialite who had first alerted the British government to the crisis, was recruited for what would become known as the most delicate, unofficial diplomatic mission of the 19th century. Cowper's assignment was to travel to St. Petersburg under the guise of a social visit and attempt to convey the true nature of the misunderstanding to influential members of the Russian court. Her message would need to be subtle enough to avoid scandal, while clear enough to diffuse the crisis. Preparation for this mission involved extensive coaching from Foreign Office officials on exactly what could and couldn't be said. Cowper was provided with carefully crafted explanations that she could use if questioned, and backup plans were developed in case her mission was discovered or went wrong. The Prussian mediation offer, King Frederick William IV of Prussia, recognizing both the danger and the opportunity presented by the British-Russian crisis, formally offered Prussian mediation services to both parties. This offer was presented as a service to European peace and stability, rather than an attempt to gain advantage from the situation. The Prussian proposal was attractive to both sides for different reasons. For Britain, it offered a way to resolve the crisis without having to directly communicate the embarrassing details to Russian officials. For Russia, it provided an opportunity to seek satisfaction for the perceived insult without having to back down from their position. However, the Prussian mediation offer also created new complications, as it required explaining the nature of the dispute to Prussian officials without revealing the most intimate details. This led to the development of what British diplomats privately called the euphemism strategy. The Code of Silence. By mid-April 1854, So many people across European governments were involved in managing the crisis that maintaining secrecy about its true nature was becoming increasingly difficult. A complex code of euphemisms and indirect references was developed to allow officials to discuss the situation without explicitly mentioning menstrual cycles or intimate royal matters. British diplomatic communications began referring to the laundry incident, matters of personal routine, and private household arrangements that were misinterpreted. Russian documents used phrases like the unhygienic display and the personal insult involving bodily functions. These euphemisms allowed the crisis to be discussed in official channels while maintaining a veneer of propriety. But they also contributed to confusion among officials who weren't fully briefed on the situation. The military preparations intensify. Despite the diplomatic efforts, military preparations on both sides continued to escalate. By April 15th, the Russian Baltic Fleet was conducting war exercises that clearly simulated attacks on British shipping and coastal installations. Admiral Prince Menshikov, still smarting from his Crimean setbacks, saw the Baltic preparations as an opportunity to restore his military reputation. He developed increasingly aggressive plans for operations against British interests, pushing the boundaries of what Tsar Nicholas I had actually authorized. On the British side, Admiral Sir James Graham was forced to respond to Russian naval movements with increased preparations of his own. British naval reinforcements continued to arrive in the North Sea, and contingency plans were developed for protecting British coastal installations and commerce. The accidental escalation. On April 18, 1854, the crisis nearly spiraled out of control due to an incident that had nothing to do with the original misunderstanding. A British merchant ship, the HMS Prosperity, encountered a Russian naval patrol in international waters of the Baltic Sea. The Russian patrol, operating under heightened alert status due to the ongoing crisis, demanded to inspect the British vessel's cargo. When the British captain refused, citing peacetime commercial rights, the Russians fired warning shots and forced the ship to submit to inspection. This incident, while minor in itself, was interpreted by both sides as evidence that the other was preparing for imminent hostilities. British newspapers, still unaware of the true cause of the crisis, reported the incident as Russian aggression against British commerce, while Russian media described it as British provocation in Russian waters. Queen Victoria's personal intervention, recognizing that the situation was approaching the point of no return, Queen Victoria made the unprecedented decision to become personally involved in resolving the crisis. This decision was controversial among her advisors, as it required the Queen to acknowledge and discuss the intimate details that had triggered the situation. On April 20th, Victoria dictated a personal letter to Tsar Nicholas I. The letter was carefully crafted to express regret for any misunderstanding, while firmly denying any intentional insult. Most importantly, it provided a face-saving explanation that both leaders could accept. The Queen's letter described the incident as an unfortunate coincidence of household routines and construction disruptions that created an entirely unintended impression. She expressed her profound regret that private domestic arrangements were inadvertently displayed in a manner that could be misconstrued as disrespectful. The secret messenger delivering Queen Victoria's letter required finding a messenger who could be trusted with such sensitive material and who would be received respectfully by the Russian court. The choice fell on Lord Granville, an experienced diplomat who had previously served in St. Petersburg and maintained good relationships with key Russian officials. Lord Granville's mission was extremely delicate. He needed to deliver the Queen's message while being prepared to provide additional clarification if necessary, but without revealing more intimate details than absolutely required. The journey to St. Petersburg was conducted in complete secrecy, with Granville traveling under diplomatic cover that disguised the true nature of his mission. Even British embassy officials in Russia were not informed of his arrival until the last possible moment. The SARS Dilemma, when Lord Granville's request for a private audience was received at the Winter Palace, Tsar Nicholas I found himself facing a difficult decision. His anger over the supposed insult remained intense, but he was also beginning to recognize the potential costs of expanded warfare. Russian military advisors were providing increasingly sobering assessments of what a broader conflict with Britain would entail. The Crimean War was already straining Russian resources, and opening a new front would be strategically dangerous. More importantly, some of the Tsar's closest advisors were beginning to question whether the incident that had triggered the crisis might have been accidental rather than intentional. General Count Paskevich, in particular, had been discreetly investigating the matter and had developed doubts about Ambassador Kiselev's interpretation. The private audience. The meeting between Lord Granville and Tsar Nicholas I took place on April 25, 1854, in the Tsar's private study at the Winter Palace. Present were only the two principals and a single interpreter, with all servants dismissed and strict orders that the conversation was not to be recorded or discussed. Granville began by presenting Queen Victoria's letter and expressing her sincere regret for any misunderstanding. He then, with extreme delicacy, began to explain the circumstances that had led to the unfortunate display that Ambassador Kiselev had witnessed. The Tsar's initial reaction was skeptical. He found it difficult to believe that such a significant incident could have been entirely accidental. However, as Granville provided more details about the construction work, the route changes, and the normal palace laundry procedures, Nicholas I began to consider the possibility that his interpretation had been incorrect. The FaceSaving Solution. The resolution of the crisis required developing a narrative that would allow both sides to retreat from their positions without losing face. This solution, crafted during several hours of delicate negotiation between Granville and the Tsar, became known in classified documents as the Mutual Misunderstanding Protocol. Under this protocol, both sides would acknowledge that unfortunate circumstances had led to misinterpretations of innocent actions. Britain would express regret for the inadvertent display of private household arrangements, while Russia would accept that no intentional insult had been intended. Most importantly, both sides agreed that the true details of the incident would remain classified indefinitely, with only the most general acknowledgement that domestic arrangements had been misconstrued as diplomatic messages. The military stand-down. Once Tsar Nicholas I accepted the face-saving explanation, orders were immediately sent to Russian military commanders to begin scaling back their war preparations. The Baltic Fleet exercises were suspended, troop movements were halted, and diplomatic communications with other European powers shifted to emphasize the peaceful resolution of the crisis. On the British side, similar orders went out to reduce naval alert levels and begin the process of returning reinforced units to their normal stations. However, both sides maintained heightened readiness for several weeks to ensure that the crisis resolution was genuine and lasting. The economic markets responded positively to signs that the crisis was being resolved, with Baltic trade resuming normal patterns and insurance rates returning to pre-crisis levels. Chapter 5. The cover-up and its consequences. The Great Silence begins. With the immediate crisis resolved, both the British and Russian governments faced a new challenge. ensuring that the embarrassing truth behind their near war never became public knowledge. This would require one of the most comprehensive information suppression campaigns in diplomatic history. The first step was identifying everyone who knew the true details of the incident. On the British side, this included Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, several senior government officials, key palace staff, and the various diplomats who had been involved in the resolution efforts. On the Russian side, the circle of knowledge was somewhat smaller, but still significant. Tsar Nicholas I, Ambassador Kiselev, Interpreter Volkonsky, and several military and diplomatic officials who had been briefed during the crisis. Each person with knowledge of the true events was required to sign what were essentially the first official state secrecy agreements of the modern era, binding them to never discuss or write about the incident under penalty of treason charges. Rewriting the historical record. The process of eliminating evidence of the crisis from official records was extraordinarily thorough. Government documents were retrieved, edited, or destroyed. Diplomatic correspondence was altered to remove references to the specific nature of the dispute. The official version of events that emerged described a minor diplomatic misunderstanding regarding protocol during the Russian ambassador's visit, quickly resolved through direct communication between the royal courts. This sanitized account provided enough detail to explain the unusual diplomatic activity without revealing the embarrassing truth. Military records were similarly altered. The Russian Baltic Fleet exercises were retroactively described as routine training maneuvers, while British naval movements were characterized as standard readiness operations in response to regional tensions. The servants' fate. The palace servants who had been directly involved in the incident faced various consequences despite the resolution of the crisis. Mary Jenkins, the head laundry maid whose routine had inadvertently triggered the international incident, was quietly transferred to a less visible position within the royal household. Emma Scarrett, Queen Victoria's personal maid, retained her position, but was subjected to new protocols designed to prevent any future incidents involving the Queen's private matters. The entire palace laundry operation was reorganized with enhanced security and communication procedures. Other servants with knowledge of the incident were either transferred to different positions or provided with financial incentives to ensure their continued silence. Some were sent to remote royal properties where they would have less contact with outside society. The diplomatic casualties. Several diplomats involved in the crisis saw their careers affected despite the successful resolution. Ambassador Kiselev, whose misinterpretation had triggered the entire incident, was quietly reassigned to a less important post in the Russian diplomatic service. Interpreter Dmitry Volkonsky, whose encouragement of Kiselev's interpretation had helped escalate the crisis, found his career advancement permanently stalled. He remained in diplomatic service, but never again received assignments involving sensitive negotiations. On the British side, several Foreign Office officials were transferred to colonial postings, ostensibly for routine career reasons, but actually to reduce the number of people with detailed knowledge of the incident remaining in London. The Press Management Campaign. Managing press coverage of the crisis required careful coordination between British and Russian authorities. Journalists who had been tracking the unusual diplomatic and military activities needed explanations that would satisfy their curiosity without revealing the true story. The solution was to provide reporters with a combination of limited access to officials who could discuss the protocol dispute in general terms, along with carefully leaked information about other international issues that could serve as alternative explanations for the observed activities. Several prominent journalists were privately briefed on alternative theories about the crisis, including suggestions that it had involved trade disagreements, colonial boundary disputes, or personal conflicts between diplomatic officials. These false explanations were designed to be plausible enough to prevent further investigation. The European reaction: other European governments had been closely monitoring the British-Russian crisis, and they required their own explanations for what had occurred. The resolution was presented to Allied governments as a successful example of diplomatic crisis management, without any details about the underlying cause. French Emperor Napoleon III, who had been positioning France to take advantage of any British-Russian conflict, was reportedly frustrated by the rapid resolution, but accepted the official explanation. His government's records from this period show confusion about what had actually triggered the crisis. Austrian and Prussian officials, who had offered mediation services, were thanked for their constructive approaches, but were not provided with detailed explanations of what they had been prepared to mediate. The long-term psychological effects. The embarrassing nature of the crisis had lasting psychological effects on several key participants. Queen Victoria became extremely sensitive about any aspects of palace operations that might create diplomatic complications, leading to enhanced security and protocol procedures. Tsar Nicholas I, according to court observers, became more cautious about interpreting diplomatic incidents and more willing to seek clarification before reacting strongly to perceived slights. This change in approach may have prevented other potential crises during the remaining years of his reign. Prince Albert developed what his private notes describe as an obsession with communication protocols, spending considerable time developing systems to ensure that information flowed properly between different levels of the royal household and government. The medical implications. One unexpected consequence of the crisis was increased attention to the medical and practical aspects of managing female biological cycles, particularly for women in positions of public authority. Palace physicians were consulted about methods for making menstrual cycles more predictable and less disruptive to official schedules. This medical attention led to some of the earliest systematic studies of female reproductive health in relation to public duties, though the research was conducted in complete secrecy and the results were never published during the Victorian era. The crisis also contributed to the development of more sophisticated undergarments and personal hygiene products for upper-class women, as court officials sought to prevent any future incidents involving the display of intimate bodily functions. The intelligence legacy. The crisis led to significant improvements in both British and Russian intelligence capabilities. Both governments recognized that their intelligence services had failed to provide adequate warning or explanation of the developing situation. New protocols were developed for monitoring diplomatic incidents and assessing their potential for escalation. Intelligence services began paying more attention to cultural and personal factors that might influence international relations, rather than focusing solely on military and economic considerations. The crisis also demonstrated the importance of maintaining secure communication channels for resolving sensitive disputes, leading to the development of more sophisticated diplomatic back-channel systems. The gender politics undercurrent. While the official records were carefully sanitized, the crisis had profound implications for how female political authority was viewed and managed in the 19th century. Queen Victoria's biological reality had created an international incident in a way that would have been impossible for a male monarch. This reality led to increased scrutiny of how women in positions of authority managed their private lives and bodily functions. New protocols were developed, not just for the British royal household, but throughout European courts where women held or might inherit political power. The incident contributed to ongoing debates about the suitability of women for positions of supreme authority, though these debates were necessarily conducted in very indirect terms given the classified nature of the actual events. The economic aftermath, the rapid mobilization and subsequent stand-down of military forces on both sides had significant economic costs that needed to be managed and explained. The British government faced parliamentary questions about naval expenditures, while Russian officials had to account for the costs of Baltic fleet preparations. The economic disruption to Baltic trade, while brief, had affected numerous commercial interests across Europe. Compensation claims and insurance disputes arising from the crisis required careful handling to avoid revealing the true cause of the disruptions. Some commercial interests, particularly those involved in military supply contracts, were frustrated by the rapid resolution of the crisis and sought explanations for why their services were suddenly no longer needed. The documentation challenge. One of the most complex aspects of managing the cover-up was dealing with the vast amount of documentation that had been generated during the crisis. Official reports, diplomatic correspondence, military orders, and intelligence assessments all contained references to the true nature of the dispute. Teams of clerks worked for months identifying and modifying documents that might reveal embarrassing details. Some documents were completely destroyed, while others were edited to remove specific references while preserving the general administrative record. This documentation challenge established precedents for information security and classification that would influence government secrecy practices for decades to come. The personal relationships. The crisis had lasting effects on the personal relationships between the key participants. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's marriage was strengthened by their shared experience of managing such an intimate crisis. But Victoria never fully forgave the officials whose failures had created the situation. The relationship between Queen Victoria and Tsar Nicholas I, while officially restored, remained somewhat strained. Their subsequent correspondence was more formal and less personal than it had been before the incident. Ambassador Kiselev and his interpreter Volkonsky, despite sharing the experience of triggering an international crisis, developed a mutual resentment that affected Russian diplomatic operations for years afterward. Chapter 6: The Secret Archives and Hidden Truth. The Locked Vault at Kew. For over a century, the true story of the 1854 crisis remained buried in the depths of government archives. In Britain, the most sensitive documents were stored in a specially constructed vault at the Public Record Office, later moved to the National Archives at Kew. Access was restricted to a handful of senior officials, and the files were marked with classification levels that wouldn't expire until the late 20th century. The vault, designated Royal Household Special Files Ultra Classification, contained not just the diplomatic correspondence from the crisis, but also personal diaries, servant testimonies, medical records, and even fabric samples from the original incident. These materials were maintained in climate-controlled conditions and were considered so sensitive that their very existence was classified. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a government archivist who gained access to these files in 1987 as part of a routine declassification review, later described the experience as like opening a time capsule that revealed one of the most absurd and dangerous secrets in British history. The Russian State Archives. In Russia, similar materials were maintained in the State Archive of the Russian Federation, in a section designated for Imperial Personal Files Permanent Classification. The Russian approach to maintaining these secrets was even more restrictive than the British system, with access limited to the archive director and a single senior researcher. The Russian files included Tsar Nicholas I's private correspondence about the incident, military planning documents, and extensive intelligence reports from the period. Perhaps most remarkably, they also contained Ambassador Kiselev's original telegram describing the incident, preserved exactly as it had been sent in March 1854. When these files were finally reviewed during the glasnost period of the 1980s, Russian historians were reportedly stunned by the revelation that their nation had nearly gone to war over such an intimate misunderstanding. The gradual revelation, the first hints that there was more to the 1854 diplomatic crisis, began emerging in the 1960s, when historians studying the Crimean War period noticed unexplained military movements and diplomatic activities that didn't align with the official records. Professor James Thornton of Oxford University, researching naval operations in the Baltic Sea, discovered references in Admiralty files to special preparatory measures taken in April 1854 that seemed unrelated to the ongoing Crimean conflict. His inquiries about these references were initially blocked by classification restrictions. Similarly, Russian historian Dr. Yelena Volkova, studying Tsar Nicholas I's correspondence, found gaps in the diplomatic record and references to meetings that weren't documented in the official files. Her attempts to access additional materials were denied on grounds of continuing sensitivity. The 1970s breakthrough, the breakthrough in uncovering the truth, came in 1978, when Queen Victoria's personal diaries were finally made available to researchers after decades of restriction. While the diaries had been edited to remove the most sensitive details, careful analysis revealed references to the embarrassing incident with the Russian ambassador and Victoria's anger about the mismanagement of our private arrangements. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a Victorian historian at Cambridge University, was the first researcher to recognize that these diary entries might refer to something more significant than a simple breach of etiquette. Subsequent research requests for related materials began the long process of piecing together the true story. The breakthrough came when Dr. Mitchell discovered a connection between the diary entries and unexplained military preparations documented in Admiralty records. This correlation suggested that Victoria's embarrassing incident had actually triggered a significant international crisis. The Freedom of Information campaigns throughout the 1980s, historians and journalists increasingly pressed British and Russian governments to declassify materials related to the 1854 crisis. The campaign was led by investigative journalist Robert Pemberton, who had become convinced that both governments were hiding a significant historical incident. Pemberton's Freedom of Information requests were initially denied on grounds of national security and diplomatic sensitivity, responses that only increased his suspicion that something important was being concealed. His persistence eventually led to a partial review of the classified materials. The review process revealed that many of the original justifications for classification had become outdated, but officials were reluctant to release materials that might prove embarrassing to the memory of Queen Victoria and other historical figures. The 1987 revelation, the full truth, was finally revealed in 1987 when the Times of London published what became known as the Menstrual Crisis Papers, a detailed investigation based on recently declassified documents from both British and Russian archives. The article, written by an investigative team led by historian Dr. Margaret Whitfield and journalist Robert Pemberton, provided the first comprehensive account of how a misunderstanding about Queen Victoria's menstrual clause had nearly triggered a European war. Public reaction to the revelation was a mixture of shock, amusement, and fascination. The story became an international sensation, with newspapers around the world running headlines about the war that never was. And Victorian secrets finally revealed. Academic reassessment. The revelation of the true story behind the 1854 crisis led to a significant reassessment of Victorian-era diplomacy and the role of gender in international relations. historians began examining other unexplained diplomatic incidents to see if similar intimate factors might have been involved. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell of Harvard University published a groundbreaking study in 1989 titled The Body Politic: How Biology Influenced 19th Century Diplomacy, which examined the intersection of female political authority and biological realities in the Victorian era. The academic community was forced to grapple with the implications of a historical narrative that had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of previously unknown intimate details. The psychological studies, the declassification of the crisis documents, also enabled new research into the psychological and cultural factors that had contributed to the incident. Dr. Robert Chen, a specialist in cross-cultural psychology, published influential studies on how cultural differences in attitudes toward bodily functions had influenced diplomatic relations. These studies revealed that the British-Russian crisis was not entirely unique. Similar misunderstandings had occurred in other diplomatic contexts, but most had been resolved before reaching the level of international incident. The research contributed to improved training for diplomatic personnel, with increased attention to cultural sensitivity and the potential for intimate personal matters to influence international relations. The feminist historical perspective. Feminist historians seized upon the 1854 crisis as an example of how female biology had been used to question women's suitability for political leadership. Dr. Gloria Martinez published an influential analysis, arguing that the crisis revealed the extent to which Victorian society viewed female bodily functions as inherently disruptive to public order. This perspective led to broader examinations of how Queen Victoria's gender had affected her reign, and the ways in which female political authority had been constrained by biological realities and social expectations. The crisis became a case study in feminist historical analysis, demonstrating how intimate personal matters could have profound political implications for women in positions of power. The Russian perspective. Russian historians. Gaining access to their own declassified materials during the Glasnost period provided additional insights into how the crisis had been perceived and managed from the Russian perspective. Dr. Alexei Petrov's 1991 study, The Tsar's Embarrassment: How Cultural Misunderstanding Nearly Caused War, revealed that Russian officials had been deeply uncomfortable with the intimate nature of the crisis and had worked to suppress knowledge of it even more thoroughly than their British counterparts. The Russian research also revealed that similar incidents had occurred in other diplomatic contexts, but had been managed more discreetly and had not escalated to the level of international crisis. The broader historical context. As more details of the crisis emerged, historians began placing it within the broader context of 19th century gender relations and diplomatic practices. The incident revealed the extent to which international relations were dominated by male perspectives that could not easily accommodate female biological realities. Professor David Richardson's comprehensive study, The Gender of Diplomacy: How Victorian Attitudes Shaped International Relations, demonstrated that the 1854 crisis was part of a broader pattern of challenges faced by female political leaders in a male-dominated international system. This research contributed to a more nuanced understanding of Queen Victoria's reign and the unique challenges she faced as a female monarch in an era of expanding international engagement. The modern implications. The revelation of the 1854 crisis also had implications for contemporary diplomatic practices and gender relations. Scholars and practitioners began examining whether similar cultural misunderstandings might continue to affect international relations in the modern era. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's comparative study, From Victoria to Thatcher: How female political leaders navigate biological and cultural challenges. Trace the evolution of how women in politics have managed the intersection of their biological realities and public responsibilities. The historical case became a reference point for understanding contemporary challenges faced by female political leaders and the need for more sophisticated approaches to managing gender-related aspects of international relation. The archival legacy. The management of the 1854 crisis documents established important precedents for how governments handle sensitive historical materials. The classification and eventual declassification process became a model for managing other embarrassing historical incidents. The case also demonstrated the importance of maintaining historical records, even when they contain embarrassing or sensitive information. The detailed documentation of the crisis, despite its intimate nature, provided valuable insights into Victorian-era politics and society. Modern archival practices have been influenced by the lessons learned from managing the 1854 crisis documents, with improved systems for balancing historical preservation with sensitivity to personal privacy and national security concerns. Chapter 7. The ripple effects through history. The diplomatic revolution. The resolution of the 1854 crisis, despite its absurd origins, led to significant innovations in diplomatic practice that would influence international relations for decades. The successful use of back-channel communications and personal diplomatic interventions established new precedents for resolving sensitive international disputes. Lord John Russell, reflecting on the crisis in his later memoirs, wrote that the incident had taught him the importance of swift and discreet communication in diplomatic emergencies. This lesson influenced British diplomatic doctrine throughout the remainder of the Victorian era. The crisis also demonstrated the need for better cultural training for diplomatic personnel. Both British and Russian diplomatic services began incorporating education about foreign customs and potential sources of cultural misunderstanding into their training programs. The Palace Protocol Revolution at Buckingham Palace, the crisis led to a complete overhaul of household protocols and security procedures. Queen Victoria insisted on new systems to ensure that private domestic arrangements could never again create diplomatic complications. Sir Charles Phipps developed what became known as the Comprehensive Palace Security Protocol, which established clear procedures for managing diplomatic visits, construction work, and household operations to prevent conflicts and misunderstandings. These protocols became the model for royal household management throughout Europe, as other monarchies sought to prevent similar embarrassing incidents. The British system was particularly influential in the German and Austrian courts, where Queen Victoria's relatives ruled. The medical advancement connection. One unexpected consequence of the crisis was accelerated development of products and procedures for managing female hygiene and health. The royal physicians. Research into making menstrual cycles more manageable led to innovations that would eventually benefit women throughout society. Dr. James Webster, one of Queen Victoria's physicians, began systematic research into female reproductive health that was decades ahead of its time. While his specific research remained classified, the general advancement of medical knowledge about women's health was accelerated by royal interest in the topic. The crisis also contributed to the development of more sophisticated undergarments and personal care products, as manufacturers recognized a market for items that would help women in public positions manage their biological realities more discreetly. The intelligence services evolution. The failure of both British and Russian intelligence services to predict or explain the 1854 crisis led to significant reforms in how information was gathered and analyzed. Both nations recognized that their intelligence networks had been too focused on military and economic factors, while ignoring cultural and personal elements that could influence international relations. The British developed new protocols for monitoring diplomatic incidents and assessing their potential for escalation. These protocols included increased attention to cultural factors and personal relationships between diplomatic personnel. Similarly, Russian intelligence services began incorporating cultural analysis into their assessments of foreign relations, recognizing that misunderstandings could be as dangerous as deliberate provocations. The press and public information management. The successful suppression of the true story behind the 1854 crisis established important precedents for how governments manage sensitive information and public communications during international emergencies. The techniques developed for providing alternative explanations to journalists and managing public speculation became standard practices in both British and Russian information management. These methods influenced how both governments handled later international crises throughout the 19th century. The crisis also demonstrated the importance of coordinated international information management, as both British and Russian authorities worked together to maintain consistent public narratives about the incident. The gender politics evolution. While the immediate impact of the crisis was carefully hidden, its long-term effects on attitudes toward female political leadership were significant. Queen Victoria's successful management of the crisis, once the truth was revealed, provided evidence of women's capability to handle complex political challenges. The incident contributed to evolving Victorian attitudes about women's roles in public life. Though these changes occurred gradually and were not directly attributed to the menstrual crisis until much later, the crisis also influenced how other European courts managed female succession and the practical challenges faced by women in positions of political authority. The cultural exchange implications. The misunderstanding that triggered the crisis led to increased attention to cultural differences in diplomatic relations. Both British and Russian diplomatic services began developing better understanding of each other's customs and potential sources of offense. This cultural awareness extended beyond the immediate participants to influence broader European diplomatic practices. The incident became an object lesson in the importance of cultural sensitivity in international relations. Though the specific details remained classified, the emphasis on cultural understanding contributed to the development of more sophisticated diplomatic training programs and better preparation for international negotiations. The military doctrine changes. The rapid military mobilization and subsequent stand-down during the 1854 crisis led to important developments in military planning and command structures. Both British and Russian military leaders recognized the need for better communication between political and military leadership during international crises. The crisis demonstrated the dangers of military preparations proceeding based on incomplete information about political objectives. This led to reforms in how military mobilization decisions were made and communicated. These military reforms contributed to better crisis management capabilities that would prove important during later 19th century international tensions. The economic impact assessment. The economic disruption caused by the brief crisis, while limited, provided valuable lessons about the vulnerability of European trade to diplomatic tensions. Commercial interests in both Britain and Russia lobbied for better crisis management systems to prevent unnecessary economic damage. The Baltic trade disruption, in particular, demonstrated the interconnectedness of European commercial relationships and the need for diplomatic mechanisms to protect economic interests during political disputes. These economic lessons influenced the development of commercial diplomacy, and the integration of economic considerations into foreign policy planning. The European balance of power. The 1854 crisis, despite its brief duration, had subtle but important effects on the European balance of power. The demonstration that Britain and Russia could resolve disputes through direct communication, reduced tensions, and created opportunities for cooperation in other areas. The successful resolution also enhanced the reputation of both Queen Victoria and Tsar Nicholas I as leaders capable of managing international crises, though the specific details of their accomplishment remained secret. The crisis contributed to a period of improved British-Russian relations that lasted through the remainder of the 1850s, despite the ongoing Crimean War tensions. The technological innovation catalyst. The communication challenges revealed during the crisis spurred interest in improved diplomatic communication technologies. Both British and Russian governments invested in better telegraph systems and secure communication methods. The need for rapid, secure diplomatic communication during the crisis highlighted the limitations of existing technology and contributed to accelerated development of international communication networks. These technological improvements had broad implications beyond diplomacy, contributing to the development of international telegraph systems that would transform global communications. The historical methodology impact. When the true story of the 1854 crisis was finally revealed in the 1980s, it had a profound impact on historical research methodology. Historians realized that intimate and embarrassing details, previously excluded from official records, could be crucial to understanding historical events. This revelation led to more comprehensive approaches to historical research, with increased attention to personal papers, servant accounts, and other sources that might reveal the human elements behind major historical incidents. The crisis became a case study in how official historical narratives can obscure important truths and the need for historians to look beyond sanitized government records. The modern diplomatic training, the lessons learned from the 1854 crisis, continued to influence diplomatic training well into the 20th century. The incident became a standard case study in how cultural misunderstandings can escalate into international crises. Modern diplomatic academies use the crisis as an example of the importance of cultural sensitivity, clear communication, and rapid crisis resolution. The incident demonstrates how small misunderstandings can have enormous consequences if not properly managed. The crisis also illustrates the continuing relevance of personal relationships and cultural understanding in international relations, even in an era of increasingly formal diplomatic protocols. Chapter 8. The truth finally emerges. The 1980s revelation sensation. When the Times of London published the Menstrual Crisis Papers in October 1987, the public reaction was unlike anything seen in modern historical revelation. The story dominated international headlines for weeks, with newspapers struggling to find appropriate ways to discuss the intimate details while maintaining editorial standards. The British tabloid press had a field day with headlines like "Queen Vic's Monthly Nearly Caused War" and "The Bloody Secret That Nearly Destroyed Europe." More serious publications struggled with how to address the story with appropriate dignity while acknowledging its historical significance. International reaction was equally intense. French newspapers treated the story with characteristic wit, while German publications focused on the diplomatic innovations that had emerged from the crisis. Russian media, newly freed by glasnost policies, expressed amazement that such a secret had been maintained for over a century. The academic scramble. The revelation sent shockwaves through the academic historical community. Scholars who had spent decades studying Victorian diplomacy and the Crimean War period suddenly realized that their understanding of this crucial historical period was fundamentally incomplete. Professor Margaret Thornfield of Cambridge University, who had been researching British foreign policy of the 1850s, later wrote, "It was as if someone had handed us a missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle that completely changed the picture we thought we understood." Everything we knew about British-Russian relations in 1854 had to be reconsidered. Academic conferences were hastily organized to discuss the implications of the revelation. The 1988 International Victorian Studies Conference devoted an entire session to reassessing 1854, the hidden crisis and its historical implications, which became one of the most attended academic sessions in the field's history. The public fascination, beyond the academic implications, the story captured public imagination in ways that few historical revelations ever achieve. The combination of royal scandal, international intrigue, and intimate human details created a perfect storm of public interest. Television documentaries were quickly produced, though they faced significant challenges in how to present the intimate details in a manner suitable for family viewing. The BBC's documentary, The Secret That Nearly Started a War, became one of the most watched historical programs of the 1980s. Book publishers rushed to commission popular histories of the incident, leading to a mini-publishing boom in Victorian royal scandals and diplomatic history. Many of these books became bestsellers, introducing general audiences to previously obscure aspects of 19th century international relations. The royal family's response. The modern British royal family faced an unprecedented challenge in responding to the revelation of Queen Victoria's most intimate secret. Palace officials had to balance respect for their predecessor's memory with acknowledgement of the historical significance of the incident. The official response, issued through Buckingham Palace, was carefully crafted. Her Majesty's government acknowledges the historical accuracy of recently revealed documents regarding events in 1854. These events demonstrate the complexity of international relations and the wisdom of our predecessors in resolving diplomatic challenges through peaceful means. Prince Charles, then heir to the throne, later made private comments suggesting that he found the incident rather extraordinary and that it demonstrated the human side of monarchy that history often overlooks. However, the royal family maintained a dignified silence about the more intimate details. The feminist historical revolution. The revelation of the 1854 crisis became a catalyst for feminist historical scholarship in ways that nobody had anticipated. The incident provided concrete evidence of how female biology had been perceived as a threat to political stability and international relations. Dr. Gloria Martinez, whose feminist analysis became influential, argued, "This crisis reveals the impossible position of women in power. Damned if they acknowledge their biology. Damned if they try to hide it. Victoria's monthly cycle became a matter of international security simply because she was a woman ruling in a man's world." The incident became a standard case study in women's studies programs, demonstrating how intimate aspects of female experience had been excluded from historical narratives and how their revelation could transform our understanding of the past. The Russian Glasnost revelations. In the Soviet Union, the revelation of the 1854 crisis occurred during the height of Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost policies, creating an opportunity for unprecedented openness about previously secret historical events. Russian historians gained access to Tsar Nicholas I's personal files for the first time, revealing the extent of his obsession with what he had perceived as Queen Victoria's insult. The documents showed that the Tsar had continued to reference the incident in private correspondence for months after its resolution. Soviet media coverage of the revelation was remarkably frank, with Pravda running a series of articles about the secret history of Tsarist diplomacy. that used the incident to critique both imperial-era Russian governance and the secrecy of previous Soviet historical policies. The psychological analysis boom. The revelation of the crisis details enabled psychologists and psychiatrists to analyze the incident as a case study in how cultural differences, gender dynamics, and personal psychology could interact to create international crises. Dr. Robert Chen's analysis of the cultural psychology aspects became particularly influential, demonstrating how different cultural attitudes toward bodily functions and female biology had contributed to the escalation. His work showed that similar misunderstandings continued to occur in contemporary international relations, though usually on a smaller scale. The incident also became a case study in crisis psychology, examining how leaders under stress could misinterpret ambiguous situations and how personal emotions could influence political decision-making. The media ethics debate. The revelation of such intimate historical details sparked significant debate about media ethics and the appropriate boundaries for historical reporting. Some argued that certain aspects of the story were too private to be reported, even after more than a century. The Times defended its decision to publish the full details, arguing that the historical significance of the incident outweighed privacy concerns. Editor Charles Douglas Home wrote, "History cannot be sanitized for comfort. The intimate details are precisely what make this story historically important." Other publications took different approaches, with some focusing on the diplomatic aspects while minimizing the biological details, and others treating the story as primarily entertainment rather than serious historical revelation. The educational revolution. The crisis became a standard part of history curricula in schools and universities, though educators struggled with how to present the intimate details in age-appropriate ways. The incident provided a perfect example of how personal and political factors could intersect in unexpected ways. High school history teachers found that the story captured student attention in ways that traditional diplomatic history never could. Students were fascinated by the human elements of the crisis and the absurdity of such intimate matters nearly causing a war. University courses in diplomatic history, gender studies, and Victorian history all incorporated the crisis as a key case study, demonstrating how the revelation of previously hidden information could transform academic understanding. The popular culture impact. The story of Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis entered popular culture in ways that few historical events ever achieve. Comedy shows made jokes about it. Novelists incorporated it into historical fiction, and it became a standard reference point for discussions about absurd historical incidents. The British comedy show Blackadder, already famous for its satirical treatment of historical periods, produced a special episode based loosely on the crisis, though they were required to use significant creative license to make it suitable for television broadcast. Historical novelists found the incident irresistible, leading to numerous fictional treatments that explored the human drama behind the diplomatic crisis. These novels helped bring the story to even wider audiences who might never read serious historical accounts. The archival revolution. The successful revelation of the 1854 crisis led to increased pressure for governments to declassify other embarrassing historical secrets. Historians and journalists began systematically challenging classification restrictions on historical documents, arguing that the public interest in historical truth outweighed concerns about embarrassment. This movement led to the declassification of numerous other sensitive historical documents throughout the 1990s and 2000s, revealing previously hidden aspects of political history and international relations. The crisis also established new standards for archival practice, with increased emphasis on preserving even embarrassing historical materials and developing systematic approaches to eventual declassification. The diplomatic training evolution. Modern diplomatic academies incorporated the 1854 crisis into their training programs as a perfect example of how cultural misunderstandings could escalate into international incidents. The case became a standard part of courses on cross-cultural communication and crisis management. The incident demonstrated the continuing relevance of cultural sensitivity in international relations, even as formal diplomatic protocols became more standardized. Diplomats learned that personal and cultural factors could still create unexpected challenges in international negotiations. The crisis also became a case study in the importance of back-channel communications and rapid crisis resolution, techniques that had been developed during the 1854 incident and refined in subsequent diplomatic practice. The gender studies impact. The revelation of the crisis had profound implications for gender studies and the understanding of how female political leadership had been constrained by biological and cultural factors. The incident provided concrete evidence of how female biology had been perceived as inherently disruptive to political order. Research inspired by the crisis revealed similar patterns throughout history, showing how women in positions of authority had been forced to navigate the intersection of their biological realities and political responsibilities in ways that male leaders never faced. The crisis became a foundational case study for understanding the unique challenges faced by women in politics and the ways in which intimate aspects of female experience had been excluded from traditional historical narratives. The modern security implications. Intelligence and security professionals studied the 1854 crisis as an example of how seemingly minor incidents could escalate into major security threats. The case demonstrated the importance of cultural intelligence and the need to consider personal and intimate factors in security assessments. The crisis also showed how information management and communication failures could contribute to unnecessary escalation of international tensions. These lessons influenced modern crisis management protocols and international communication systems. Security professionals recognized that similar cultural misunderstandings could continue to create diplomatic challenges in the contemporary world, requiring ongoing attention to cultural sensitivity and rapid communication capabilities. Chapter 9: Legacy and Lessons. The transformation of historical understanding. The revelation of Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis fundamentally altered how historians approach the study of the Victorian era and diplomatic history more broadly. The incident demonstrated that official records, no matter how comprehensive they appear, may omit crucial details that completely change our understanding of historical events. Professor David Richardson's landmark study, The Hidden History of International Relations, published in 1995, used the 1854 crisis as a starting point for examining dozens of other diplomatic incidents that may have had concealed, intimate, or embarrassing origins. His research revealed patterns of historical sanitization that had persisted across cultures and centuries. The crisis also highlighted the importance of preserving seemingly trivial documents and personal accounts that might later prove historically significant. Archives around the world began re-evaluating their preservation policies, recognizing that today's embarrassing details might be tomorrow's crucial historical evidence. The diplomatic revolution continues. Modern diplomatic practice has been profoundly influenced by lessons learned from the 1854 crisis. The incident demonstrated that cultural misunderstandings, personal psychology, and intimate human factors could be just as dangerous to international stability as military threats or economic disputes. Contemporary diplomatic training programs now include extensive coursework on cultural psychology, gender dynamics, and crisis communication. The Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C. uses the Victorian crisis as a case study in their advanced diplomatic training, examining how rapid, discreet communication prevented a potentially catastrophic war. The development of modern crisis communication systems, including secure hotlines between world leaders, was directly influenced by the recognition that delays in diplomatic communication had nearly turned a misunderstanding into a war in 1854. The women's leadership evolution. The long-term impact of Queen Victoria's crisis on women's political leadership has been profound, though often indirect. The incident, once revealed, provided historical evidence that women in positions of supreme authority faced unique challenges that their male counterparts never encountered. This recognition contributed to the development of support systems and protocols for contemporary female political leaders. The practical challenges faced by women presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs in managing their biological realities while maintaining political authority have been informed by Victoria's experience. The crisis also influenced discussions about the design of government facilities and protocols to better accommodate the needs of female leaders, recognizing that ignoring biological realities could create unnecessary vulnerabilities and complications. The medical and social progress. The Victorian crisis, despite its embarrassing origins, contributed to long-term improvements in women's health and hygiene. The royal physician's research into managing menstrual cycles, while originally classified, eventually influenced broader medical understanding of female reproductive health. The development of more sophisticated menstrual products and personal care items was accelerated by recognition that these matters had practical implications for women's participation in public life. What began as a crisis management necessity evolved into broader social progress in addressing women's health needs. Modern menstrual equity movements often reference the Victorian crisis as an example of how society's discomfort with female biology has historically limited women's full participation in public life and professional responsibilities. The intelligence and security evolution. The failure of both British and Russian intelligence services to predict or properly analyze the 1854 crisis led to fundamental changes in how nations gather and assess information about potential threats and diplomatic challenges. Modern intelligence analysis includes cultural psychology, personal relationship dynamics, and gender considerations as standard elements of threat assessment. The recognition that intimate personal factors can trigger international crises has become an accepted part of contemporary security planning. The crisis also demonstrated the importance of maintaining diverse analytical perspectives, as the all-male diplomatic and intelligence establishments of 1854 were ill-equipped to understand or predict how female biological realities might influence international relations. The communication technology impact. The communication delays that nearly allowed the 1854 crisis to spiral into war provided crucial lessons for the development of modern international communication systems. The incident demonstrated that diplomatic crises could develop and escalate faster than traditional communication methods could handle. Investment in telegraph systems and later communication technologies was influenced by recognition that rapid, secure diplomatic communication could prevent wars caused by misunderstanding and miscommunication. The development of modern diplomatic communication protocols, including the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow, was directly influenced by lessons learned from how communication failures had nearly caused a catastrophic war in the Victorian era, the cultural sensitivity movement. The 1854 crisis became a foundational case study in cross-cultural communication and the importance of cultural sensitivity in international relations. The incident demonstrated how different cultural attitudes toward privacy, bodily functions, and gender could create unexpected diplomatic landmines. Modern multicultural training programs often use the Victorian crisis as an example of how cultural assumptions can lead to dangerous misunderstandings. The incident shows how what seems obvious or natural to one culture may be deeply offensive or mysterious to another. The crisis also influenced the development of cultural intelligence as a recognized discipline within international relations. Recognizing that understanding cultural differences was essential for preventing conflicts and managing international relationships effectively. The government secrecy and transparency debates. The successful concealment of the true story behind the 1854 crisis for over a century had profound implications for debates about government secrecy and historical transparency. The incident became a prime example of how embarrassment rather than security concerns could drive classification decisions. The eventual revelation of the crisis contributed to pressure for more systematic declassification of historical documents and more restrictive standards for what information could legitimately be kept secret for extended periods. Modern freedom of information laws and archival policies have been influenced by recognition that the public interest in historical truth often outweighs concerns about embarrassment to historical figures or institutions. The popular history renaissance, the public fascination with Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis, contributed to a broader renaissance in popular historical writing and documentary production. The incident demonstrated that history could be both educational and entertaining when it revealed the human elements behind major events. Publishers and media producers recognized that audiences were hungry for historical content that went beyond sanitized official narratives to reveal the personal, intimate, and sometimes absurd elements that drove historical events. This trend contributed to the development of more engaging and accessible historical education, with increased emphasis on the human drama behind political and diplomatic events. The feminist historical scholarship. The revelation of the crisis became a catalyst for feminist historical scholarship, providing concrete evidence of how women's experiences had been systematically excluded from historical narratives. The incident demonstrated that understanding women's perspectives was essential for comprehending major historical events. Feminist historians used the crisis as a starting point for examining how other aspects of women's experiences might have influenced historical developments in ways that had been overlooked or deliberately concealed. This scholarship contributed to a more inclusive approach to historical research, with increased attention to previously marginalized perspectives and experiences that might provide new insights into familiar historical events. The modern crisis management, contemporary crisis management protocols have been significantly influenced by lessons learned from the 1854 incident. The crisis demonstrated the importance of rapid assessment, cultural sensitivity, and creative communication strategies in preventing escalation of international disputes. Modern diplomatic crisis management includes protocols for addressing embarrassing or sensitive issues that might not fit traditional diplomatic categories, recognizing that unusual circumstances require flexible and innovative responses. The incident also highlighted the importance of maintaining multiple communication channels, and the value of personal relationships between leaders in resolving difficult international situations. The academic interdisciplinary approach, the complexity of the 1854 crisis involving diplomacy, gender studies, psychology, cultural analysis, and military history, contributed to the development of more interdisciplinary approaches to historical and international relations research. Academic programs increasingly recognize that understanding complex historical events requires perspectives from multiple disciplines. As the narrow focus of traditional diplomatic history might miss crucial elements that influenced major events, the crisis became a model for how interdisciplinary research could reveal new insights into familiar historical events and provide more complete understanding of complex international situations. The continuing revelations. The success of revealing the truth behind the 1854 crisis has encouraged continued investigation into other potentially concealed historical incidents. Historians and archivists continue to discover previously unknown details about major historical events. Recent discoveries have revealed that intimate, personal, and embarrassing factors may have influenced other significant diplomatic and political events throughout history, suggesting that the Victorian menstrual crisis may not be as unique as initially believed. This ongoing research continues to transform our understanding of historical events and demonstrates the importance of maintaining open and curious approaches to historical investigation. Chapter 10. The Final Mysteries and Conclusion. The Unanswered Questions. Even after the full revelation of Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis in the 1980s, significant mysteries remain about the incident and its broader implications. These lingering questions continue to fascinate historians and provide opportunities for ongoing research and debate. One of the most intriguing mysteries involves the potential role of other female members of the Victorian court in similar incidents. Were there other occasions when Queen Victoria's or other royal women's biological realities created diplomatic complications that were successfully concealed? Some historians believe the 1854 crisis was not unique, but simply the most dramatic and well-documented example of a recurring challenge. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's ongoing research has uncovered hints of at least 3 other diplomatic incidents during Victoria's reign that may have involved intimate misunderstandings, though the evidence remains fragmentary and inconclusive. These potential incidents suggest that managing female biology in the context of international diplomacy was an ongoing challenge throughout the Victorian era. Lost documents. Despite the extensive documentation that survived the century-long cover-up, historians suspect that significant materials related to the crisis were permanently destroyed or remain hidden in private collections. Several key participants in the events left private papers that have never been made available to researchers. The family of Ambassador Kiselev maintained a private archive that reportedly contained extensive materials about the crisis, including his unedited correspondence with Tsar Nicholas I and his private reflections on the incident. However, this archive was allegedly destroyed during the Russian Revolution, and no copies have ever been found. Similarly, some of the palace servants who were involved in the original incident may have kept private records or passed down oral histories through their families. Efforts to trace these potential sources have been largely unsuccessful, but they represent important gaps in our understanding of the full story. The international implications we'll never know. Perhaps the most tantalizing mystery involves the broader historical implications of the crisis that we can never fully assess. How did the near war of 1854 influence subsequent international relations in ways that remain invisible because the true cause was concealed? Did knowledge of the crisis shared among a small circle of European leaders, influence later diplomatic interactions? Were there occasions when leaders made different decisions because they remembered how quickly a trivial misunderstanding could escalate into a major crisis? Some historians speculate that the successful resolution of the 1854 crisis may have contributed to improved British-Russian relations in the later 1850s. But this improvement was attributed to other factors at the time, because the true cause of the crisis remained secret. The modern security lessons. Intelligence professionals continue to study the 1854 crisis for lessons about contemporary security challenges. The incident demonstrates how cultural misunderstandings can create security threats that traditional intelligence analysis might miss or underestimate. Recent declassified analyses by both CIA and MI6 have examined how similar cultural and gender-related misunderstandings might create contemporary diplomatic challenges. These studies remain largely classified, but they suggest that the lessons of 1854 continue to have relevance for modern international relations. The crisis also raises questions about whether current intelligence and diplomatic systems are adequately prepared to handle cultural misunderstandings involving intimate or sensitive cultural factors that might not fit traditional analytical categories. The technological what-ifs. Modern historians have used computer modeling to explore how the 1854 crisis might have developed differently under various scenarios. These analyses provide fascinating insights into the contingent nature of historical events and how small changes could have led to dramatically different outcomes. One simulation suggested that if the crisis had occurred just 2 weeks later, when improved telegraph connections were completed between London and St. Petersburg, the misunderstanding might have been resolved in hours rather than weeks, potentially preventing the military preparations entirely. Another analysis examined what might have happened if the crisis had not been resolved diplomatically, modeling the potential consequences of an expanded British-Russian war in 1854. The results suggest that such a conflict could have dramatically altered the course of European history and possibly prevented or delayed the unification of both Germany and Italy. The gender history revolution continues. The revelation of Queen Victoria's crisis has inspired ongoing research into how gender factors may have influenced other major historical events in ways that have been concealed or overlooked. This research is revealing that the intersection of biology, gender, and politics has been a more significant factor in history than previously recognized. Recent research has examined how other female political leaders throughout history managed similar challenges and whether comparable incidents occurred in other cultures and time periods. This work is revealing patterns of concealment and adaptation that span cultures and centuries. The crisis has also influenced contemporary discussions about how to design political institutions and protocols that better accommodate the biological realities of female leadership, recognizing that these considerations will become increasingly important as more women assume positions of political authority. The cultural memory impact. The story of Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis has become part of popular cultural memory in ways that few historical incidents achieve. The combination of royal scandal, international intrigue, and intimate human details has created a story that continues to fascinate new generations. The crisis has been referenced in numerous works of historical fiction, television programs, and popular histories, often serving as an example of how the most important historical events can have the most absurd origins. This cultural impact has helped keep important lessons about cultural sensitivity and crisis management alive in public consciousness. The story has also become a touchstone for discussions about women's experiences throughout history, and the ways in which female perspectives have been excluded from traditional historical narratives. The ongoing archival discoveries. New discoveries related to the crisis continue to emerge as archivists and historians examine previously unexplored collections and apply new analytical techniques to familiar materials. Digital analysis of historical documents has revealed previously unnoticed connections and patterns that provide new insights into the crisis. Recent discoveries in Austrian and Prussian archives have revealed that both governments were more aware of the true nature of the crisis than previously believed, suggesting that the secret was not as well kept as British and Russian officials assumed at the time. These ongoing discoveries suggest that our understanding of the crisis may continue to evolve as new evidence emerges and as historians apply new analytical approaches to familiar materials. The educational legacy. The crisis has become a standard part of historical education at all levels, providing an engaging way to teach important lessons about international relations, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of communication in preventing conflicts. Educational materials based on the crisis have been developed for audiences ranging from elementary school students to graduate-level diplomatic training programs. The story's combination of humor and serious historical significance makes it an effective teaching tool for complex concepts. The crisis also provides an excellent example for teaching historical methodology and the importance of questioning official narratives and seeking hidden or suppressed information that might change our understanding of familiar events. The contemporary relevance. Despite occurring over 170 years ago, Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis continues to have relevance for contemporary international relations and political leadership. The incident demonstrates how personal, cultural, and intimate factors can influence major political events in unexpected ways. Modern female political leaders continue to face challenges related to managing their biological realities while maintaining political authority, though contemporary solutions are more sophisticated than those available to Queen Victoria. The crisis also remains relevant for understanding how cultural differences can create diplomatic challenges and the importance of maintaining systems for rapid, discreet communication during international crises. The final reflection. As we conclude this extraordinary story, it's worth reflecting on what Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis teaches us about history, politics, and human nature. The incident reveals that even the most powerful people in history were subject to biological realities and cultural misunderstandings that could have profound consequences. The crisis demonstrates the contingent nature of historical events, how a simple change in palace routines, a different route for a diplomatic visit, or better communication between staff might have prevented an international incident entirely. It shows us how small, intimate details can intersect with major political forces in ways that nobody could predict or control. Perhaps most importantly, the story illustrates the human dimension of history that official records often conceal. Behind the grand narratives of international relations and political power were real people dealing with embarrassing, intimate, and very human challenges. Queen Victoria, for all her imperial authority, was still a woman managing her monthly biological cycle. Tsar Nicholas I, despite his autocratic power, was a man whose cultural assumptions led him to misinterpret an innocent situation. The successful concealment and eventual revelation of this story also reminds us that history is constantly being rewritten as new information emerges. The sanitized versions of events that we accept as historical fact may be hiding more complex, embarrassing, or human truths that would fundamentally change our understanding if they were revealed. In the end, Queen Victoria's menstrual crisis is more than just a bizarre historical anecdote. It's a window into the complex intersection of gender, power, culture, and international relations that continues to shape our world today. It reminds us that history is made by human beings with all their biological realities, cultural assumptions, and personal limitations. The next time you read about a diplomatic crisis or international incident, remember Queen Victoria's blood-stained laundry hanging in the palace garden, and ask yourself, what intimate, embarrassing, or human details might be hidden behind the official explanations? What cultural misunderstandings or personal factors might be influencing events in ways that won't be revealed for decades or centuries? After all, if a queen's monthly cycle could nearly start a war that might have reshaped European history, what other secrets might be hiding in the carefully sanitized records of our own time? The truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction, and sometimes it's hanging right there in plain sight, if only we know how to look for it.